Hello, everyone. It is Chrissy Alger here. Really excited for today's content on this YouTube episode. It's a bit of a vulnerable one, if I'm to be honest, about my leadership journey and how I've really evolved from dictator to empowered leader. And I think it's really important to share the journey because I think the journey of leadership can be a really challenging one, regardless of what your vulnerabilities might be in leadership. But it's also the highest impact journey in the sense that if you are able to really develop your leadership to higher levels and more effectiveness and more significant degrees of influence, I truly believe that it is the one thing that can absolutely transform your business. So let's get into it. The story behind my own leadership experiences is an interesting one. For those of you that may not be familiar with my story, before opening a skin clinic and really getting into the industry, my profession is that I'm a psychologist, but I spent many years in the prison system, the Victorian prison system, as a psychologist, but also engaged in leadership teams. I sat on executive boards within the prison system. So it wasn't just about me functioning as a psychologist and treating violent offenders. It was also about me stepping through the ranks and being able to develop leadership capacity to be able to oversee clinical, what's the word for it? Clinical units of prisons, therapeutic program oversight, recruitment of psychologists and therapists that were helping with the work, and then also coming to sit on prison executive teams that also oversight the good order and the running of the prisons. So that's a very interesting origin when it comes to leadership. And I want to share this with you because it kind of helps you understand why I might have started the leadership pathway in the way that I did. The prison system leadership modeling is very hierarchy based. So there are ranks of prison officers, there are ranks of leadership, senior prison officers, operations managers, governors. Like, it's all a very hierarchical system. The other part of that hierarchical system is it was predominantly male. So it was a very masculine leadership approach. It was very authoritarian. Basically, you do what you're told, right? Was the established culture around leadership when it came to the prison system. Now, when you think about even just the prison system in general, it's a very hardened environment. You were dealing with extremely difficult people, and both in prison environment as far as the prisoners went, in addition to the staff and the leadership. There were leaders that had been in that environment for 20 or 30 years, right? They were very institutionalized, patriarchal levels of leadership in there that had been long-standing, very entrenched, very authority-based. So you could imagine that, their openness to new ideas, innovations, females, like, let's be honest, was difficult at times. So my ability to influence started in those very rigid, regimed, male-dominated structures. And I had to be very creative about the way that I engaged these individuals to be able to, get decisions made in my favour, or to get things across the line, to get approval for things, to get prisoners out of, isolation so that they could still do their treatments. Like, there was really high levels of influence required from me as an exec leader, as a clinical manager, as all of these things, just to be able to survive my day and get positive outcomes for myself. So when I left the prison system, as you could imagine, my approach, to be completely honest, was very dominant. It was completely masculine. And when I say masculine, it's kind of like straight to the point. It's rigid. There is negotiation is there, but it's quite dominating. You know, it's probably, in all fairness, to say scary. That's why I opened this title of the YouTube to be Dictator, because that's kind of how I rolled out of the prison system. It was kind of like, you know, this is the way things need to be done. You know, and again, despite me being a psychologist and having some soft skills in terms of communication and asking questions and things like that, the leadership element of what I was doing was still very hardened. It was very hardened. And I think that, you know, when you exist in a prison environment for 10 years, it's hard not to be. You know, you've really got to build. I'll never forget, there was one day I walked into, and this is what you're dealing with on a daily basis. I walked into an operations manager's office to have a meeting with an operations manager about some issues. And before I even spoke, he grabbed a coffee cup and pushed it towards me on the table and just looked at me. You know, like that's the sort of stuff that I was faced with on a daily basis in trying to establish my ability to contribute, be part of leadership, influence positive outcomes. And yeah, it was tough, you know. And, you know, one of the reasons why I left the prison system was because I was starting to realize that the hardened exterior that had built, you know, it's almost like a calloused skin around me emotionally, you know, was starting to look pretty unhealthy by the end of it. There is a natural, what's the word for it? There's almost like a natural inclination towards, if you want to, well, it's all self-preservation, but you build these brick barriers around yourself because of what you're seeing, because of what you're hearing, because of what you're dealing with on a daily basis. So here comes me, new business owner, opening up a wellness center, right? Opening up a wellness center, growing teams. You know, at some stages I would have 10 to 20 on team, you know, across the site. You know, there was stages where I had 12, 13, 14 on team at my skin clinic. And then I would have a whole yoga team. I would have allied health team. Like I would have all of these people directly reporting into me. And then I think add the other pressures of no money, you know, lots of financial stress, wearing all of the hats, never having a business before, plus a hardened, dominant, masculine leadership style. And you could probably imagine that it was a recipe for disaster, right? And I'll talk to you about some of the impacts of this, you know, that I saw before I realized that I probably had to make some changes in my approach. So I would call my approach direct and assertive, right? And I think that there was a fine line between that directiveness and that assertiveness and aggression, if I'm to be completely honest. I wasn't afraid to have difficult conversations, but I didn't really understand that there needed to be a degree of sensitivity around difficult conversations. I listen to myself saying this now and I'm like, what happened to you in prison? I want to give myself a hug because it's like, you know, there was no sensitivity in the prison environment. There was none. You know, it was that survival of the fittest, right? Particularly as a female in that environment. So it was kind of like go hard or go home. And when you're exposed to that for such a long period of time, you almost desensitize yourself to difficult conversations actually having an impact on people. So I would be in one-to-one meetings and I'd be rolling out the feedback, not just be watching people like shrinking. And I'd be confused, to be honest. Like, I'd be like, oh, sort of what's happening here? I can see this person shrinking down into their seat. I'm providing what I think is really productive feedback, constructive, and they're shrinking. And even I would get caught out in moments when people would start crying. I would be like, I'm not really sure what's happening here. I was just completely desensitized coming out of the prison environment. So I would have, the symptoms of, leadership that is not helpful or leadership that's not working was that real trauma response that I was witnessing in my one-to-ones of people shrinking, people shutting down. Often people would say to me that things are all good, and then I would actually find evidence for the fact that it wasn't all good, and that would really make me frustrated because I'm like, well, am I being lied to? Like, why isn't anyone prepared to come forward with the information that I need to be able to help them when they're saying it's all good, and then I've got evidence to suggest that it's not good? It's because they were so scared. They were scared to actually come forward and say, hey, I think this is an issue, or, I think we really need to look into this. The people would just shut down. And there was not the degree of emotional safety that was needed for people to be open, collaborative, even though I was inviting collaboration. There was collaboration with apprehension because people were like, well, I might put something on the table, but I'm a bit scared about how it's going to be received because if she doesn't like it, she's going to tell me she doesn't like it. And that's really going to wound me, and I didn't really get, it's like, okay, well, if I don't like something, it's not the end of the world. That's cool. But to other people, it was hurtful. And I was so emotionally disconnected to what that experience was like for other people that I was surprised, I suppose, when people were reluctant to put things on the table. They would present an impression that everything was fine when it actually wasn't. I would get resignations just come out of nowhere. Like, I would be completely blindsided and go, I thought this person was really happy. They weren't, but they were still too freaking scared to tell me that they weren't, right? Because I didn't create emotional safety. There was experiences in the team, like the team feeling like nothing was ever good enough. It was like we didn't celebrate the wins because it was like, right, okay, cool, we got that. Where's the next thing? Where's the next thing? Where's the next thing? That relentlessness, and again, when you're in a pressurized environment and you also have some high achiever tendencies, you literally run people into the ground, right? You literally run people into the ground. You burn them out, right? They want to give, and they do. And then it's kind of like nothing's ever, before we get to appreciate what we've achieved, we're gunning for the next level, and that burns people out, right? And that was a product of my unrelenting standards, my own internal experiences of nothing ever being good enough for me, and maybe even deeper than that I'm not good enough unless I'm being validated by my external environment. That there was a lot of pressure financially going on in the business that then created this real relentless sort of pursuit of the next outcome that made it difficult for my team to just stop and smell the roses before we were chasing the next thing. There was no fun. It wasn't fun because the energy was unforgiving in terms of standards. It was go, go, go. And don't get me wrong, like, and I'll talk about my evolution around this. There are still moments where I've got to harness this in, you know, because my psychology and the way that I'm built is very driven. It's very relentless. It's quite masculine, you know, for lots of different reasons in terms of my early learning experiences and things that have happened in life. So it's a job every day to soften this down and to keep, you know, what's the word for it? To keep developing myself to be someone that gets results without actually running people into the ground, including myself, right? You know, so having even worked with business owners on the complete opposite end of this, right? So if I'm up this end of dominating, aggressive, kind of unrelenting, sort of go, 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 there's also a flip side to this that I've had to help business owners with that is almost like so fearful of standard boundaries, putting in place expectations that none of it exists. And then they're completely run over the top of by their team members that are not responsive to any sort of leadership attempts. That's the other end of the scale, you know, and often these business owners have been people pleasers. I don't want to upset anyone. I don't want to have confrontation. You know, I don't want to get uncomfortable. I'm scared of, you know, emotional discomfort. And then therefore the other end of this is about, it's just lawless. It's just team members doing whatever they like. It's team members taking advantage of. It's team members not being responsive to standards, expectations. So there's also the other end of the spectrum that, as you could imagine, I haven't had personal experience with, given I sit on the other end of the scale, but I have absolutely met those experiences in my coaching clients and had to nurture different levels of leadership around boundary setting and standards and self-confidence and capacity to, you know, engage with people even when it might feel uncomfortable, that also requires degrees of support and everywhere else on the spectrum, right? Because when we think about leadership, you know, it really is the pinnacle factor to business success, right? Even if you're not working, even if you don't have teams, your self-leadership is often the one thing that determines your business success. If you can't lead yourself, like even, you know, when we think about that spectrum of, and I'll give you the two examples of self-leadership on this end of the spectrum of the person that has no boundaries, no standards, scared to lead, is being walked all over, right? You know, that's that sort of people-pleasing element. You know, their psychology is about avoidance. You know, that makes it very difficult for them to take on a leadership role. You know, and then versus the other end where it's that relentless, aggressive, masculine, that's coming from a place of avoidance of vulnerability because that's scary, and that has been dangerous for them in the past when they've been vulnerable, traumas, whatever that might be. So they swing in the other direction, you know. So self-leadership around those elements. So you, on the passive end, it's about self-leadership towards being more assertive, being able to hold boundaries, being able to have courageous conversations. That's self-leadership. And you're not going to be able to influence others unless you start to lead yourself differently first. Same as on the other end, self-leadership is about empathy. It's about gratitude, right? It's about being able to appreciate, being able to be sensitive to the needs of others without bulldozing people. That's the self-leadership element to that really masculine, dominant way of leadership. So for you to be a better leader, and this is what I'm going to lead into, mostly it starts with your own internal dynamics, you know, why you're doing what you're doing. What is that a product of? You know, what is that a symptom of, you know, inside of you? So being able to become a better leader, in my opinion, first and foremost, is about doing the internal work. You know, it's about addressing some of the long-standing patterns of self-sacrifice, people-pleasing over here, the aggression, the avoidance of vulnerability, the relentlessness, you know, the unrelenting standard over here. What's driving it? What's inside of you that needs to be addressed? You know, what are the traumas? What are the what's the driving force behind some of these, what we would call maladaptive behaviors that's showing up in your leadership, right? So first and foremost, it's your willingness and your preparedness to go in and do that as long as you're on this journey, because you evolve and you become different humans at different stages of your business journey experience, and you need to be willing to keep looking inside to see what's influencing the way that you're showing up in your leadership. So it's that willingness to go in and understand yourself, develop self-awareness and insight into some of the functions of your behavior, and then obviously put strategies in place to be more effective in the way that you're leading people, right? So that's first and foremost. I think that one of the other big lessons is around understanding performance and how it actually works. You know, if you just take my leadership style, being a dominant sort of masculine style, basically it was trading on fear that would get people to perform, right? When we look at performance psychology, and that's effectively what we're trying to master here, is when we're influencing people, we're trying to influence them to higher levels of performance, not just performance with clients and getting client results and outcomes and, you know, a really high standard of service delivery, but also performance of the self, how they show up, how they communicate, how they interact, what's their discipline look like, right? So performance plays a big element of the outcome that you're looking for through your leadership. So when we look at this end of the spectrum, the performance that I was getting was fear-based performance. Short-lived, doesn't work. People either burn out, they leave. It's not sustainable when you're influencing performance based on fear. And then on the other end of the spectrum, so for the self-sacrifices and the people pleasers that are too afraid, performance is not even induced at all, because there's no expectation of performance when you're sitting around the other end. You know, so really understanding performance psychology is critical to you being able to refine your skill sets as a leader, right? So performance psychology is also another important element. The third element of this that I come to refine that I think is really important is around the skill of communication, right? So, yep, the internal work, super important. Yes, understanding psychology and performance and the way that operates is super important, but your ability to actually communicate in a way that nurtures relationships and connectedness with your team members is absolutely crucial. You know, back in the day, I didn't prioritize the relationships, I prioritized the outcomes. And I was willing to sacrifice those relationships and that connection day in, day out, because all I was looking at was the outcome. What I didn't realize that I could actually get the same outcome and an even better outcome if I invested in the connection with the team members. But it didn't occur to me that was part of the process. I just thought, well, if I pushed people hard enough, that they'd get the result. Yeah, they might, like I said before, they might get the result, but they're in shreds at the end of it. They're burnt out. They don't want to do it anymore at the end of it, or they just leave. So you've got this revolving door of workforce because people can't cope with the situation, right? So I had to learn that when I was communicating with people, there was a way of doing that that protected the safety of the relationship, that also nurtured the connection, and I'd get even better results as an outcome to that. On the other side, when I was mentoring business owners that were fearful of completely fearful of communication to them was like it was a confrontation, right? And any explicit conversation around standards or expectations or needs being met on your part was actually about an argument or a conflict or an extreme experience, a heightened sort of expectation that this was going to lead to a very uncomfortable situation, which then led them to not communicate, completely shutting down communication, avoiding communication because of the fear that it's not going to go well. You know, and obviously that being linked to possible traumas or difficulties or challenges that they'd had in the past with communication. So refining that communication skill is critical to you being able to show up as an influential leader. And the main aim of the refinement of the communication is around the connection and the relationship safety, right? That you can still have difficult conversations. It can be delivered in a kind and compassionate way. It will lead to the outcome, but it doesn't fracture the relationship in the process, right? Or you can have conversations if you're more passive, and it doesn't have to lead to a conflict or that catastrophized sort of, this is going to be the thing that breaks everything if I have this conversation with this person, right? And then the final element of my leadership jigsaw puzzle that really became evident to me that was a vulnerability was that obviously down this end of the spectrum, when you're authoritative in what you're doing, you're telling people what to do all the time. And that is, I call that transactional leadership, that it's kind of like people, it's based on the belief that people need to be told what to do, otherwise they don't do it to the standard, or they make mistakes, or they forget, or, but fundamentally that approach is flawed because it creates a very difficult leadership style where if you're not telling, things don't happen, and that's not sustainable. You absolutely go mad because it's like you become responsible for all of these human beings. I used to liken it, and I've referenced this before, the adult daycare center type scenario where no one can make a decision, first of all, because they're too fucking scared, right? Because they're fearful of the response of the leader, the dictator, if they were to make a mistake. So they just, they just detach or refuse to make decisions in fear. But then also the other element is that they don't have to because they're told. So there can be a degree of like the motivation's not there, because as long as they're being told what to do, when to do it, how to do it, what it needs to look like, and they got all of the in between, they don't have to think for themselves, right? So then you end up in this really high stress situation where you're having to move all the puppet pieces to get the outcomes, right? And that's associated with that dominant sort of telling transactional leadership style that's just not sustainable, right? So what I learned was that didn't feel good. That was super stressful. I didn't want my business to rely on me to get things done, right? So I realized that I had to actually build leaders. I needed to build team members that actually thought for themselves, or what we call that is autonomy, that they actually are able to work through problems. They're able to come up with their own solutions. They can access support if they need to, but they can work unsupervised. They can do things without needing you there. But it was a process to be able to build the skill sets in the team members to be able to do that. And I do that a lot. And I really do believe that building autonomy is something that is underrated. It's something that sometimes business owners just think that team members should just have. It's like, God, don't people think for themselves? Isn't that common sense? Like there's just an expectation that you will get team members that are autonomous. The reality is that doesn't happen, you know? So then it's kind of like, well, I'm going to avoid my responsibility of building common sense in somebody. That's the ego-driven sort of expectation. And really my approach now is that, team members don't come to you with these skill sets. When you are invested in mentoring, you need to be invested beyond the performance results. You actually have to be invested in the human being and the vulnerabilities and the challenges that they have, whether it be in communication, whether it be in problem solving, whether it be in relationship and connection. You need to be willing to go there, in my opinion. Now, don't get me wrong, you don't need to be a therapist or a counsellor. There's boundaries around that. You can recommend additional support systems for them if you can see that relationships are a real problem for them in the team environment and it seems to be linked to something else, there can be a recommendation of support there. But in your leadership, you need to take ownership around adopting approaches that start to get your team to think for themselves, right? And then on the other end of the scale, when you've got that real passive, fearful, avoidant leadership approach, you're not building leaders, you're building dominance. You're putting yourself in a position where you're just going to completely be overrun by the opinions, the attitudes, the needs of all of the other people, and that's, just as challenging as having the other where you're completely transactional and you're henpecked and you have to think for everybody, to you're not doing that over here, but it's kind of like a leaderless ship. Too many cooks in the kitchen, everyone's got an opinion, no one's really following a cadence or a process, everybody's got their own opinions on how it's going to go, and it's just completely, it's anarchy is the way to describe it, when you're not fostering that assertive approach and being able to build leaders that are autonomous and take ownership, but not in a way that is what's in it for them and the business working around them and them not avoiding responsibility or taking on, what's the word for it? I suppose ownership of their success and their outcomes for their clients. So it really, there is this real spectrum of polarization when it comes to leadership, and the refinement of the skill sets required to balance out this polarization is the journey, it's the work, So I think that one of the biggest bottlenecks that I see, if I'm to tap into the Debbie world, Debbie being the person that just doesn't get it, doesn't get leadership. The Debbies of the industry are very much about it's the team members' fault. At some of the comments that I made before about they don't use common sense, they don't think for themselves. It's that leadership approach where you believe that, the success of your business is dependent on, wholly and solely on other people, and it's got nothing to do with you. It's sometimes that approach that you'll be able to just hire these unicorns that'll just come in and just do what they're supposed to do. Well, they're qualified, aren't they? It's almost like there's a detachment from leadership as being the thing that's going to help drive the outcomes, because you just expect that people should have it sorted, and then also the big vulnerability is that it's all everybody else, it's not me. I hear it all the time. I hear people saying things like, oh, there's no good people to hire. Again, you should come with the full skill set. You should come, at a really high standard. You should come knowing all of these things, right? That the unicorn should just drop out the sky and be able to hit the ground running, or vulnerabilities in the leadership being completely evident, but there being a degree of, no, but it's their fault. For example, in the passive leader, they're looking around going, well, they should be able to just do what they're supposed to without me being on their shoulder. yeah, like I get that, but given you're so passive, you're not even leading people. You're not even holding the standard. So it's not their fault, that's your fault, right? And then on the other end of the scale, you know, it's you going, oh, well, people just don't do what they're told, and I have to think for everybody, and this is not fair. And but at the same time, you're dictating, you're dominating, you're telling people, which completely disempowers them and makes them scared. Therefore, why would they ever want to think for themselves when it's so freaking scary? So there's some really good examples of how often people can look outwards and start pointing the fingers outwards when really needs to come inwards. Really need to start to look at yourself as being the key element to the success of your business when it comes to influencing people, when it comes to leadership, right? It's you and only you, right? As the pivotal piece. So, you know, I'm really excited because I've got a free masterclass coming up. I've got a link in the comments that you can click and join. The session is called Fearless Leader, and I'm going to be dropping into a lot more detail in terms of the internal skill sets, a lot of the lessons and the experiences that I've learned, and also some of the key pathway, well, the key elements on the journey of fearless leadership or more influential leadership that you might want to take into account to be a lot more influential in the way that you're supporting your team members, and also even the way that you're living your life in terms of your self-leadership. So, you know, this is for you if you really feel like you need some help dialing in your skill set of leadership. This is for you if you have struggled with these polarizations, the passive versus the dominant. You really want to find the middle ground on that. This is for you if you really don't feel like you're getting the best out of your team right now when it comes from a performance perspective. But at the same token, this is not for you, right? If you think that leadership is actually not the essence of success, or you're not open to that, you think that it is everybody else's fault and you're not willing to move on that, you know, you really need to be open to your own internal transformation to be able to get benefit from the Fearless Leader Masterclass. So as I said, it's free. Come along, check it out. It's happening in a week or so. The dates are on the link. You can check all of that out, and hopefully I'll see you there.